The night sky over Washington is burning. It is August 24th, 1814, and the heart of the young American Republic is being swallowed by fire. Flames roar from the roof of the Capitol, leaping high enough to light the streets for miles. The White House, pride of a nation barely 30 years old, is a blackened shell, its walls hissing as paint blisters and wood collapses into ash. British redcoats march calmly through the chaos. They are not looting, they are carrying out orders to destroy every public building in direct retaliation for America's own burning of York in Canada. There are no American defenders left in the city. The government has fled. Washington, the seat of power, lies helpless. It is a humiliation unlike anything the United States has faced before. And yet, this night of fire is not the end of the war. It is not even Britain's final strike. The question is, how did a conflict over trade and sailors spiral into the burning of a capital, and how did America survive it? The War of 1812 did not begin with fire, but with a slow burn. In the decades after the American Revolution, the United States was a young, ambitious republic trying to find its footing in a world still dominated by old empires. Britain, though forced to recognize American independence in 1783, had never truly accepted the loss with grace. Trade disputes simmered. Borders along the Great Lakes and in the northwest frontier remained unsettled. And across the Atlantic, Britain was locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon's France, a war that shaped every decision it made overseas. Caught between these two European giants, the United States struggled to assert its rights. The seas were a dangerous place for American commerce. Britain's Royal Navy, desperate for manpower, routinely stopped U.S. merchant ships, searching for deserters, and often taking American sailors by force, a practice known as impressment. To the United States, it was an insult to sovereignty. To Britain, it was necessity. Trade itself became a weapon. Britain imposed tight restrictions, blocking American goods from reaching European markets unless they passed through British control. France responded with its own decrees. American merchants, especially in New England, watched their profits vanish, while Southern and Western politicians seethed at what they saw as imperial arrogance. In Congress, a group of fiery young legislators, soon called the War Hawks, argued that the only solution was to defend national honor with arms. They saw the British presence in Canada as a lingering threat and believed that a quick strike northward could secure new territory while forcing Britain to back down. The opposition, centered largely in the Northeast, warned that the nation was unprepared, its navy too small, its finances too weak. Beyond the political chambers, the frontier was already a battleground. In the Old Northwest, Native American confederations, led by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, resisted American expansion. Britain, eager to keep the United States in check, provided these groups with weapons and supplies from Canada. For many Americans, this was proof of British hostility, and reason enough for war. By the spring of 1812, the temperature in Washington had reached a breaking point. President James Madison, once reluctant to fight, now faced mounting pressure from Congress and the public. On June 18, 1812, the United States formally declared war on Britain, for the first time in its history, an act approved by Congress. What followed would not be the swift, decisive campaign the War Hawks imagined. Instead, the war would stretch over 2.5 years, fought on land and sea, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. It would bring humiliating defeats and unexpected victories, test alliances, and leave scars both physical and political. And less than 2 years after its start, it would lead to the night the world saw Washington burn. The brig Chesapeake Belle left Boston in the summer of 1811 with a cargo hold full of tobacco, cotton, and grain. Her crew of 25 were mostly young New Englanders, hardened by the Atlantic but not by war. They expected storms, maybe pirates, not the Royal Navy. 3 days into open waters, the lookout spotted a towering silhouette on the horizon, a British frigate, sails taut, hull black against the sky. The Union Jack snapped in the wind. There was no chase. The frigate simply bore down, cutting across the brig's path with the authority of a highwayman blocking a coach. British Marines came aboard with polished muskets and cold efficiency. They carried lists, names of supposed Royal Navy deserters, but the search went far beyond that. Each man was examined, questioned, and if his accent or manner suggested Britain or Ireland, he was claimed. By the time they were done, 5 American sailors had been marched onto the frigate's deck, bound for service in a war they had no stake in. This was impressment in its rawest form. Britain claimed the right to reclaim deserters anywhere on the high seas, the United States cow. Led it legalized kidnapping. The young men taken from the Chesapeake Belle vanished into the Royal Navy's ranks, their families never hearing from them again. News of the incident spread quickly in American ports. Merchants cursed the British. Dockside taverns buzzed with talk of honor, sovereignty, and revenge. Newspapers printed the names of the impressed sailors, alongside calls for Congress to act. The Chesapeake Belle became one more case in a growing ledger of grievances, a symbol of how far Britain was willing to go to treat the United States not as a sovereign equal, but as a rebellious colony still needing discipline. But even then, most Americans had no idea just how quickly these insults at sea would ignite a war on land. By late 1811, the floor of Congress had become a battlefield of words. On one side stood the war hawks, young, fiery legislators like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They spoke with the conviction of men convinced that America's honor was bleeding out with every ship stopped, every sailor taken. To them, British interference was not just about trade. It was a calculated humiliation, proof that the Revolution's victory had not secured true independence. On the other side, Federalist representatives from New England warned that a war would devastate commerce. They pointed to the fledgling state of the U.S. Navy, barely 16 warships compared to Britain's hundreds, and the nation's fragile finances. "We cannot fight the empire that rules the seas," they argued. "We will be ruined before we are respected." The debates were not just partisan, they were personal. Reports of frontier violence, skirmishes between settlers and native confederations supplied by British agents, landed like blows in the chamber. Every news story from the Great Lakes or the Ohio frontier tilted more votes toward war. President James Madison, a cautious man by nature, had tried diplomacy. He had sent envoys, offered compromises, and even passed trade restrictions meant to pressure Britain without bloodshed. But each gesture was met with the same reality. British warships still prowled American coasts, still boarded American vessels, still took American men. By June 1812, the tide inside Congress shifted. The war hawks had the momentum, and the growing chorus of outrage could no longer be ignored. On June 18, 1812, for the first time in its history, the United States formally declared war. A vote carried largely along sectional lines, with most opposition coming from the commercial Northeast. The declaration was met with cheers in the South and West, unease in New England, and disbelief in London. Few on either side expected a long war, yet within weeks, America would discover that striking at the British Empire was far more dangerous than Congress had imagined. In the summer of 1812, the declaration of war was still fresh ink on parchment, but its shadow stretched across the nation. For civilians, especially in vulnerable coastal towns and frontier settlements, the war was not a distant matter of diplomacy. It was an approaching storm. In Baltimore, shipyards hammered day and night, converting merchant vessels into makeshift privateers. The docks smelled of tar, pine, and urgency. Sailors swore oaths to fight, not for government pay, but for the promise of prize money from captured British ships. In New York Harbor, families watched the horizon for sails that might bring mail, or invasion. More swirled about British fleets gathering in Halifax, ready to descend on the American coast. Far inland, on the northwest frontier, the danger was different, but just as real. Settlers built blockhouses and stockades, their walls barely higher than a man, to protect against raids by Native American warriors allied with Britain. The stories from Kentucky and Ohio were grim. Barns burned in the night, livestock driven off, entire families vanished. Even in cities far from the front lines, the sense of threat was palpable. Newspapers carried maps showing British forts in Canada, and public meetings debated whether American forces could march north before British regulars marched south. In taverns, talk of defending the Republic was mixed with worry over food prices, shortages, and the fate of loved ones at sea. Women organized to sew uniforms, roll bandages, and gather supplies for militias. Churches held services asking for divine protection. Children were told to stay indoors after dusk. The war was not yet marked by great battles, but it was already shaping daily life. Americans were learning that war was not only fought by armies, it was endured by entire communities. And as the nation braced for the first blows, it faced a dangerous truth. The enemy could strike in more places and with more allies than most realized. The War of 1812 was not only fought with muskets and cannons, it was fought with ink, speeches, and symbols. In a nation where not everyone agreed the war was wise, convincing the public to support it became its own battlefield. In Washington City, newspapers friendly to the Madison administration printed fiery editorials. They painted Britain as a bully on the seas, trampling American rights and dignity. Political cartoons showed British officers dragging American sailors in chains, or King George III looming over the U.S. Capitol like a vulture. The war hawks in Congress gave rousing speeches for the record, speeches that were reprinted in sympathetic presses from Kentucky to Georgia. They framed the conflict as a second war of independence, a test of whether the United States could truly defend itself from imperial aggression. But in New England, where trade with Britain had been the lifeblood of ports like Boston and Salem, the message was very different. Federalist-leaning papers condemned the war as Mr. Madison's folly, warning that it would ruin commerce and invite devastation. Some openly questioned whether the federal government had the right to risk the livelihoods of thousands for what they saw as an abstract principle of honor. On the frontier, propaganda took another form. Handbills and tavern talk spread tales, some true, others exaggerated, of Native American raids, blaming British arms and gold for every attack. The goal was simple, to keep militia enlistments high and public anger higher. Songs and slogans did their part. Free trade and sailors' rights became a rallying cry, printed on banners, painted on ship hulls, and sung in the streets. Local printers produced broadsides with heroic verses celebrating privateers and militia captains, often before a battle was even fought. By the end of 1812, the nation's morale was divided but loud. The war had become a matter of pride for some, survival for others, and political ammunition for all. What few realized was that words could only carry the war so far. Soon, the battlefield itself would decide who was right. From the very start, America's war strategy was ambitious, some would say reckless. The war hawks envisioned a swift invasion of Canada that would cripple British influence on the continent and force them to negotiate. The acquisition of Canada will be a mere matter of marching, declared one congressman. But the map told a harsher story. The northern frontier stretched hundreds of miles along lakes, forests, and rivers. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, and supplies had to be hauled by wagon or boat through rough terrain. In summer, travel was slow. In winter, it was brutal. The plan split American forces across two main fronts: a push from Detroit into Upper Canada, a drive from New York toward Montreal, cutting the St. Lawrence supply line. Meanwhile, the coastal defenses had to be strengthened against possible British naval attacks, a drain on already limited manpower. The United States Army, numbering fewer than 7,000 regular soldiers at the war's start, would have to rely heavily on state militias. These militias were often poorly trained, inconsistently armed, and reluctant to fight outside their home states. Coordinating them across such vast distances was a logistical nightmare. British Canada, though sparsely populated, had well-positioned forts and the advantage of naval control over the Great Lakes. Even more crucially, Britain could call on Native American allies, who knew the terrain and could strike quickly against American supply lines. Still, American leaders pressed ahead, confident that victory would come before Britain could send large reinforcements. It was a gamble on speed, geography, and underestimating the enemy, a gamble that would soon backfire. Because before the war's first year was over, the easy march into Canada would turn into a humiliating retreat, setting the tone for much of the conflict to come. The summer of 1812 brought the first major American campaign, and one of its most humiliating defeats. The U.S. plan to seize Upper Canada began with General William Hull, a Revolutionary War veteran in his late 50s, leading a force from Ohio toward the British post at Fort Malden. His army included a mix of regulars and Ohio militia, many untested in combat. Crossing into Canada in July, Hull quickly realized his supply lines were fragile, and his men were already demoralized. Skirmishes with native warriors, led by the formidable Tecumseh, kept the Americans on edge. Hull hesitated, fearing a counterattack. Instead of striking Fort Malden decisively, he pulled back to the safety of Fort Detroit, a move that surrendered the initiative. In August, British Major General Isaac Brock and Tecumseh brought the fight to Detroit. Brock's force was smaller than Hull's, but his tactics were bold. Through careful positioning and the visible presence of hundreds of native warriors, he convinced Hull that he faced a much larger army. Brock sent a demand for surrender, warning that if battle came, he would not be able to control his native allies from massacring civilians. The bluff worked. On August 16, 1812, without firing a shot, Hull surrendered 2,000 soldiers, along with the fort and the entire Michigan territory. The news stunned the nation. To the British, it was a strategic victory and a morale boost for both regular troops and native allies. To Americans, it was a disgrace. Hull was court-martialed for cowardice, narrowly escaping a death sentence thanks to his Revolutionary War service. The loss of Detroit shattered American hopes for a quick victory in the Northwest and emboldened Britain's native allies. For the first time, it became clear that the war would be long, costly, and fought on terms the United States could not fully control. While American armies led on land in 1812, the nation's mariners were about to deliver unexpected victories at sea, not through the small U.S. Navy alone, but through a wave of privateers. Privateers were privately owned ships granted government licenses, letters of marque, to capture enemy vessels. They were essentially legal pirates, and in a war where Britain's navy dwarfed America's, they became an essential weapon. From Baltimore, Salem, and New York, sleek schooners and brigs slipped into the Atlantic, armed with cannons but built for speed. Their captains knew the sea lanes and the merchant routes Britain depended on. Instead of challenging the mighty Royal Navy head-on, they hunted vulnerable supply ships carrying sugar, rum, and manufactured goods from the Caribbean and Europe. One such vessel, the Chasseur, earned the nickname Pride of Baltimore after capturing or sinking more than a dozen British ships in a single cruise. Another, the Yankee, seized so much cargo that its profits enriched its investors and crew for years. Privateering had a psychological effect that far outweighed its strategic scale. British merchants demanded better protection, insurance rates skyrocketed, and news of captured prizes boosted morale back home. In ports like Baltimore, returned privateers were greeted as heroes, their flags paraded through cheering crowds. Not everyone approved. Britain called the practice dishonorable, and even some Americans saw it as profiteering under the guise of patriotism. But in a war where the U.S. Navy could not hope to blockade Britain, privateers turned the Atlantic into a hunting ground the enemy could never fully control. By the end of the war's first year, privateers had taken hundreds of British ships, proving that even without a massive fleet, America could sting its opponent on the open seas. Still, these victories at sea could not erase the defeats on land, and the British were preparing to tighten their grip where America was weakest. In the early months of the war, Britain treated the American conflict as a sideshow, a distraction from the far greater struggle against Napoleon. But by late 1812, that view began to shift. News of American privateers capturing valuable merchant ships, combined with the embarrassment of U.S. naval victories like the U.S. Constitution's defeat of HMS Guerriere, could not be ignored. In Halifax and Quebec, British commanders received new orders: tighten the blockade, crush American incursions, and make the cost of war unbearable. Reinforcements trickled across the Atlantic, even as Britain fought in Europe. Experienced officers, men who had seen the Napoleonic Wars firsthand, arrived to take charge. The Royal Navy expanded its blockade of the American coastline, sealing off major ports from New England to the Chesapeake Bay. Merchant ships rotted in harbor, imports of manufactured goods slowed to a trickle, prices rose, smuggling became a way of life in some coastal towns. On land, British and Canadian forces pressed their advantage in the north. Along the Niagara frontier, they clashed with American troops at Queenston Heights, where British regulars and Canadian militia, supported by native allies, threw back a U.S. invasion. The death of American General Isaac Brock at the battle was a loss for Britain, but the victory cemented Canadian morale. Tecumseh's warriors continued to harass American outposts, making every supply convoy a potential target. In Washington, the mood shifted from optimism to grim determination. The Warhawks' confident predictions of a quick conquest of Canada now looked dangerously naive. For Britain, the counterpunch was about more than territory. It was about reminding the young republic that it faced the most experienced military machine in the world. The question was no longer whether Britain could defend Canada, but how far it might go to punish the United States for daring to challenge it. By 1813, the British blockade wasn't just a distant inconvenience. It had arrived on America's doorstep. The Chesapeake Bay, with its deep waters and countless inlets, became a prime target for the Royal Navy. British warships cruised at will, their tall masts visible from the shores of Maryland and Virginia. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, commanding the raids, understood the psychological value of striking civilian targets. His orders were blunt: harass the coast, burn supplies, and make the local population feel the war in their own homes. Small towns like Havre de Grace and Georgetown awoke to the thunder of cannons, their waterfronts set ablaze before militia could muster a defense. The raids were swift and precise. British landing parties destroyed warehouses, shipyards, and food stores. Plantations along the rivers were stripped of livestock, sometimes with enslaved workers escaping aboard British vessels, offered freedom in exchange for service. For civilians, the war became terrifyingly personal. Families fled inland, leaving behind homes and livelihoods. Farmers plowed fields with one eye on the horizon, knowing redcoats could appear at any moment. The smoke of burning towns was a constant reminder that the United States could not protect every community. In Norfolk, militia drilled in the streets while merchants petitioned Congress for better defenses. But the truth was plain. The British could strike anywhere the Navy could sail, and there was little the Americans could do to stop them. The Chesapeake Campaign achieved its aim. It drained American resources, spread fear, and undermined confidence in the government's ability to defend its people. And for Admiral Cockburn, the raids were just the beginning. His sights were set on something far greater than fishing towns and warehouses. In the War of 1812, the Great Lakes were more than vast stretches of water. They were highways for armies, supply lines, and a strategic prize neither side could afford to lose. Whoever controlled the lakes could move troops quickly, resupply isolated forts, and threaten deep into enemy territory. By 1813, Lake Erie became the focal point of this contest. The Americans, recognizing their disadvantage, began an ambitious shipbuilding program at Presque Isle, modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania. Under the command of a young, determined officer, Oliver Hazard Perry, shipwrights labored through the summer, crafting a small fleet from green timber. Supplies had to be smuggled past British patrols, and even the cannons came from far-flung foundries. The British, based at Amherstburg, had the advantage of early dominance, but they faced shortages of their own, and the harsh logistics of frontier warfare meant every plank and nail was precious. The showdown came on September 10, 1813, in the Battle of Lake Erie. Perry's fleet met the British head-on in a fierce, close-range slugging match. When his flagship, the Lawrence, was battered beyond fighting, Perry famously rode under fire to the Niagara, taking command and breaking through the British line. By the end of the day, the British squadron had surrendered. Perry's victory message, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," became an instant rallying cry across the United States. The triumph on Lake Erie did more than boost morale. It forced the British to abandon Detroit, cut off their supply lines, and gave the Americans control of the entire lake. For the first time in the war, the tide in the Northwest shifted decisively in America's favor. But control of the lakes was just one theater in a sprawling conflict. Elsewhere, British forces were preparing to strike at the very heart of the young republic, a blow that would indeed burn itself into American memory forever. By the summer of 1814, the war had entered a dangerous new phase. In Europe, Napoleon's defeat freed British troops and ships for redeployment. Now, for the first time, Britain could bring its full weight against the United States. The strategy was clear: strike hard, demoralize the enemy, and force a favorable peace. Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross were tasked with a bold mission: attack the Chesapeake, disrupt the American government, and destroy its capacity to wage war. With a fleet of warships and a seasoned force of soldiers fresh from the Peninsular War, they sailed up the bay, landing at Benedict, Maryland in August 1814. American defenses were thin. The militia system, already stretched, struggled to gather men quickly. Many assumed the British would target Baltimore, not Washington, and position their forces accordingly. That miscalculation would prove disastrous. Ross's column advanced inland in the oppressive summer heat, meeting little resistance until Bladensburg. There, on August 24th, hastily assembled American troops, militia, sailors, and a handful of regulars faced the British. What followed became known as the Bladensburg races, as inexperienced militia broke and fled under disciplined British musket volleys and Congreve rocket fire. The road to Washington now lay wide open. President James Madison, cabinet members, and their families scrambled to evacuate. Important documents and treasures, including the Declaration of Independence, were hurriedly removed from public buildings. The British march was relentless. In less than 48 hours from landing, they stood at the gates of the U.S. Capitol, ready to deliver a strike that would echo through history. The question was no longer whether Washington would fall, but how much of it would survive the night. On the evening of August 24, 1814, Washington's skyline glowed with an unnatural light. Not the sunset, but fire. The British, victorious at Bladensburg, marched directly into the nation's capital with orders to destroy all public buildings. Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn led disciplined columns through streets eerily empty of defenders. The capital, still under construction, was first. British troops piled furniture in chambers, doused it with gunpowder paste, and set it alight. Flames roared up the rotunda, shattering windows and sending smoke curling into the humid night. Next came the president's mansion. Inside, a table was still set for a dinner James and Dolly Madison had intended for senior officers. Cockburn, savoring the irony, reportedly ordered the troops to eat before torching the house. By midnight, the building's walls glowed red from the heat, its roof collapsing into a heap of embers. War and weather soon collided. As fires consumed the city, a violent storm swept in. Some accounts describe a tornado touching down, tearing roofs from houses and toppling chimneys. The downpour helped douse the flames, but also added to the chaos, scattering British troops as they completed their mission. Civilians watched from the outskirts, stunned and silent. For them, this was more than the destruction of buildings. It was a symbolic assault on the nation's very identity. In one night, the young republic's capital was reduced to charred stone and smoldering ash. By the next morning, the British began withdrawing. They had no intention of holding Washington. The attack was meant to humiliate and demoralize, proving that even the seat of American power could be reached and burned. But instead of breaking the American spirit, the destruction of Washington would ignite a wave of determination that the British did not fully anticipate. Fresh from burning Washington, the British turned their attention to Baltimore, a far more valuable target. Unlike the lightly defended capital, Baltimore was a thriving port, a hub of privateering activity, and a symbol of American defiance. If Washington had been meant as a humiliation, Baltimore was meant to be a crippling blow. In September 1814, a British fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, carrying troops under Major General Robert Ross and a powerful naval contingent. But Baltimore was ready. Learning from Washington's fate, the city's leaders had fortified key approaches. Fort McHenry guarded the harbor entrance, while thousands of militia and regulars manned defensive lines east of the city. On September 12th, Ross led his troops ashore at North Point, advancing toward the city. American forces, though outnumbered, fought stubbornly. In the opening skirmishes, Ross was struck by a rifle shot and mortally wounded, a severe blow to British command and morale. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy began bombarding Fort McHenry on September 13th. For 25 hours, rockets and mortar shells rained down on the fort, their arcs lighting up the night sky. Inside, the defenders endured deafening blasts, but held their ground. At dawn, the British saw something that dashed their hopes. Through the smoke and mist, a massive American flag still flew above the fort's ramparts. The defenders had withstood the assault, and Baltimore remained out of reach. This moment would inspire Francis Scott Key, who witnessed the battle from a detained truce ship, to write a poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner. The failure at Baltimore marked a turning point. The British could still raid and blockade, but their ability to decisively defeat the United States on land was fading. The question now was whether both sides would keep fighting or find a way to end the war. While Washington smoldered and Baltimore stood defiant, the northern frontier remained a brutal battleground. In late 1814, the United States aimed to strike a decisive blow by invading Canada once more, this time through the Lake Champlain corridor. Commanding the American defense was Brigadier General Alexander Macomb, a capable officer with a small but disciplined force at Plattsburgh, New York. Across the border, a massive British army under Sir George Prevost advanced south, supported by a fleet on Lake Champlain. Their goal was ambitious: crush the northern defense, seize control of the lake, and use that leverage at the peace negotiations already quietly underway in Europe. The campaign hinged on a combined land and naval assault. On September 11, 1814, as British troops neared Plattsburgh, their fleet under Captain George Downey engaged the smaller American squadron, commanded by Commodore Thomas McDonough. The fighting was intense and close quarters, with ships exchanging broadsides at point-blank range. McDonough executed a daring maneuver, using anchor cables to pivot his flagship Saratoga mid-battle, bringing fresh guns to bear on the battered British ships. One by one, the enemy vessels surrendered or drifted away. With the fleet destroyed, Prevost had no choice but to retreat, abandoning the invasion. The victory at Plattsburgh was more than a tactical triumph. It denied Britain a major bargaining chip and proved that, even late in the war, American forces could repel a full-scale assault. For soldiers who had endured years of frustration and retreat, it was a moment of vindication. Yet despite this success, the war's outcome still hung in the balance. Britain remained capable of devastating raids, and peace talks were fragile. The winter of 1814 would determine whether the war dragged on, or ended with both nations claiming victory. By late 1814, both of the United States and Britain were weary. For Britain, the Napoleonic Wars had drained resources and manpower. For America, the cost of defending such a vast frontier had strained the treasury and public patience. Neither side had achieved an overwhelming advantage, but each had reasons to seek an honorable peace. Negotiations had been quietly underway in Ghent, Belgium, since the summer. The American delegation, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin, faced seasoned British diplomats who initially demanded sweeping concessions, large tracts of American territory, control over the Great Lakes, and a buffer native state in the Northwest. But the strategic situation was shifting. The British failure at Baltimore, the decisive American victory at Plattsburgh, and the ongoing cost of the blockade weakened London's bargaining position. In addition, merchants pressured Parliament to restore profitable trade with the United States. The Americans, though emboldened by recent successes, also recognized the limits of their endurance. The war's original issues, maritime rights and impressment, had faded in importance after Napoleon's fall, as Britain no longer needed to seize American sailors for its navy. Through the autumn, the talks in Ghent became a chess match of offers and counteroffers. In the end, both sides agreed to the simplest solution: status quo ante bellum, restoring borders to their pre-war lines with no territorial gains for either side. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Word of the agreement, however, would take weeks to cross the Atlantic. Until then, armies and navies on both sides would continue to fight, unaware that the war was, at least on paper, already over. The stage was set for one final spectacular battle that would come after the treaty, shaping the war's legacy in ways no diplomat could have predicted. Even as diplomats inked the Treaty of Ghent, the war's bloodiest chapter had yet to be written. News of peace had not reached the Gulf of Mexico, where Britain saw an opportunity to seize New Orleans, the gateway to the Mississippi River and a choke point for American commerce. Controlling it would give Britain immense leverage, treaty or no treaty. In late 1814, a powerful British expeditionary force under Major General Edward Pakenham sailed for the Louisiana coast. Veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, they carried the confidence of men who had faced and defeated the best armies in Europe. Their plan was to land south of New Orleans, advance along the river, and crush the city's defenses in a single decisive blow. In New Orleans, the task of defending the city fell to Major General Andrew Jackson. Known for his fierce temper and unyielding will, Jackson pulled together a force as diverse as the city itself. Regular army troops, local militia, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, and even the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte and his smugglers, who brought valuable artillery and supplies. The British landed in December and quickly established a foothold. Skirmishes erupted in the surrounding swamps and cane fields, with both sides probing for weakness. Jackson, understanding the stakes, fortified a defensive line along the Rodriguez Canal, using earthworks, cotton bales, and artillery to block the British advance. For weeks the tension built. The British believed their superior discipline and numbers would overwhelm the ragtag defenders. Jackson, however, was confident his men could hold if they stood firm behind their works. The stage was set for a battle that would decide not just the fate of New Orleans, but the final impression each nation would carry from the War of 1812. At dawn on January 8, 1815, a thick morning fog drifted over the British camp along the Mississippi, PPI. Under Major General Edward Pakenham, thousands of redcoats prepared to storm the American lines. They moved with quiet precision, scaling ladders and carrying fascines, bundles of sticks to fill the Rodriguez Canal, confident that one final push would shatter Andrew Jackson's defense. But the fog lifted too soon. As the red lines emerged from the mist, American artillery roared to life. Jackson's gunners, many of them pirates from Jean Lafitte's Baratarians, fired with deadly accuracy. Grapeshot tore through tight British formations, cutting swaths in the advancing ranks. The British pressed forward, but confusion reigned. Critical scaling ladders were misplaced. Officers were struck down early. Pakenham himself rode forward to rally his men, only to be mortally wounded by canister fire. His second-in-command, Major General Samuel Gibbs, fell soon after, and the attack faltered. Behind the earthworks, Jackson's mixed force of regulars, militia, free men of color, and native allies held firm. The cotton bales absorbed musket fire, and every attempt to cross the canal met with devastating volleys. Within half an hour, the assault collapsed into retreat. The results were staggering. Over 2,000 British casualties compared to fewer than 100 Americans. For Britain, it was a humiliating defeat. For the United States, it was a triumphant finale. Though the battle had no effect on the already signed Treaty of Ghent, it electrified the American public and transformed Jackson into a national hero. In the swamps of Louisiana, the war had ended not with a negotiated whimper, but with a cannon's roar, sealing the War of 1812 in a blaze of victory for the young republic. When the guns fell silent on January 8, 1815, the battlefield before New Orleans was a grim sight. Rows of British dead lay scattered in the damp Louisiana fields, their scarlet coats stark against the muddy ground. Survivors tended to the wounded, many of whom faced long, painful recoveries far from home. The air was heavy with smoke, the smell of gunpowder mingling with that of churned earth and blood. Andrew Jackson walked the lines, acknowledging his men's steadfastness. They were farmers, sailors, frontiersmen, and freedmen who had stood shoulder to shoulder against one of the most powerful armies in the world. In the city, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets, their cheers echoing off the old French quarter's walls. For the British, the defeat was more than tactical. It was a blow to morale and prestige. The failure to take New Orleans ensured that Britain had gained no bargaining chip in the Gulf region. The war, already costly and unpopular at home, now had an exclamation point of loss. Yet neither side knew the full truth, that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed 2 weeks earlier, ending the war. With communications dependent on ships crossing the winter Atlantic, news of peace was still in transit. Fighting continued simply because no one had told the soldiers it was over. When the treaty's ratification finally reached the United States in February, the Battle of New Orleans was instantly recast in public memory. Though it had not altered the treaty's terms, it became a symbol of American resilience and victory. In the years ahead, this battle would grow in legend, and Jackson's image as the fearless defender of New Orleans would propel him toward the presidency. But the war's human cost, the lives ended and futures shattered, lingered quietly behind the celebratory headlines. The War of 1812 had lasted barely 2.5 years, but its toll was immense. The United States had entered the conflict with limited military resources, relying heavily on state militias and hastily assembled naval squadrons. By its end, the nation's treasury was nearly exhausted. War expenditures had doubled the national debt, forcing the government to issue bonds and suspend certain public projects just to keep the armies supplied. The British blockade had choked American commerce. Ports from New England to the Gulf of Mexico saw their trade routes cut off, leaving merchant ships idle and warehouses empty. Imports of manufactured goods plummeted, leading to shortages and skyrocketing prices. Ironically, these shortages spurred the growth of domestic manufacturing, planting early seeds of American industrialization. The human cost was no less staggering. Thousands of soldiers and sailors on both sides had been killed or wounded, often in brutal conditions far from adequate medical care. Frontier communities had endured raids, displacements, and the destruction of homes and farms. For Native American nations, many of whom had sided with Britain in hopes of halting U.S. expansion, the war's end marked a devastating shift. Without British military backing, they faced increasing pressure from American settlers moving westward. Politically, the war deepened divisions at home. In New England, the conflict had been widely unpopular, leading to the Hartford Convention, where some Federalists even discussed the possibility of secession. Though the convention's proposals were moderate, the timing, just before news of New Orleans and peace, made the Federalists appear unpatriotic, contributing to the party's decline. Yet for all its costs, the war left the United States with a stronger sense of identity. It had survived a test against one of the world's greatest powers, defended its sovereignty, and emerged more confident in its place on the global stage. But beneath the celebratory rhetoric lay an unspoken truth. The War of 1812 had been as much a war of endurance as of glory. When the cannons finally fell silent, the War of 1812 slipped into an unusual place in history, overshadowed by the American Revolution before it and the Civil War to come. Yet its impact was profound, shaping the nation's trajectory for decades. For the United States, the war confirmed its survival as a sovereign power. Britain had failed to redraw its borders or curb its ambitions, and though no territory changed hands, Americans framed the outcome as a second war of independence. The resilience shown at Baltimore, Plattsburgh, and New Orleans became woven into the young republic's narrative of defiance against foreign might. The war also forged new heroes. Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans catapulted him to national fame, paving the way for his presidency. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry and Captain Isaac Hull became naval icons, while lesser-known figures, from free black militiamen in Louisiana to frontier women tending the wounded, left quieter but enduring marks on the war's memory. For Britain, the conflict was a sideshow to the Napoleonic Wars, but it reinforced the need to respect American maritime rights. For Native Americans, however, the war was a devastating setback. Leaders like Tecumseh had fought for a united indigenous front, but his death and Britain's retreat left Native nations vulnerable to relentless westward expansion. Culturally, the war gave the United States its national anthem. Francis Scott Key's verses, inspired by the defense of Fort McHenry, would not become official until a century later, but they captured the spirit of resilience that many Americans took from the conflict. Still, the war's memory remained contested. Was it a victory, a draw, or an unnecessary gamble? Each answer depended on perspective, and in that ambiguity lay the war's enduring fascination. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. America entered the war divided and uncertain, and emerged, however narrowly, more unified in its belief that it could stand among nations. And yet, as history would prove, unity was fragile, and the next great test was already on the horizon. The War of 1812 ended as it had begun, in ambiguity. No sweeping territorial conquests, no decisive surrender on either side. On paper, it was a stalemate, but in the realm of memory and identity, its consequences rippled far beyond the treaty's words. For the United States, the war was a coming-of-age ordeal. It tested whether the young republic, barely 3 decades removed from its birth, could defend itself against the world's dominant naval and colonial power. It proved that survival was not an accident of geography or luck, but the product of resolve. From sailors battling blockades in the Atlantic to militiamen holding improvised lines in swamps and forests. The war reshaped the country's political landscape. The Federalist Party, tarnished by its opposition to the conflict, faded from national relevance, leaving the Democratic Republicans dominant in what would be called the era of good feelings. Nationalism surged, carrying with it a pride that sometimes glossed over the war's costly lessons. For Britain, the war reaffirmed the need for diplomacy with the United States. No longer an upstart colony, America was now a neighbor that had proven it could resist military coercion. For Native American nations, however, the war's close was a catastrophe. Without British protection, their lands were increasingly vulnerable to American settlement, accelerating a tide of displacement and dispossession that would define the century. Culturally, the war left behind touchstones of identity: the Star-Spangled Banner, the enduring legend of Old Ironsides, and the image of Andrew Jackson standing unflinching at New Orleans. These became symbols not just of martial success, but of a spirit Americans would claim as uniquely their own: resilient, resourceful, and unwilling to yield. And yet, for every triumphant story, there were thousands untold, of families who never saw loved ones return, of towns reduced to ashes, of sailors lost at sea without a grave. These silent legacies remind us that war's real cost is paid not in treaties, but in lives. Looking back, the War of 1812 resists easy categorization. Was it necessary? Could it have been avoided? Did it truly change the balance between Britain and America? Historians still debate these questions, but perhaps the war's most enduring lesson is less about geopolitics than about endurance itself. Because in 1812, the United States stood at a crossroads, uncertain, divided, and far from the industrial power it would one day become. By 1815, it had faced down invasion, seen its capital burned, and still found the will to fight back. In that transformation lay the seed of a nation's confidence, for better and for worse. 2 centuries later, the echoes remain. In the national anthem's verses, in the preserved battlefields and the weathered cannons that still guard some harbors, in the quiet graves along the northern frontier and Gulf Coast, and in the knowledge that the test of a nation is not only in the wars it wins, but in the storms it weathers. From the smoke over Washington to the dawn at New Orleans, the War of 1812 left no crown won, no empire toppled, only a young republic that, in standing its ground, learned the weight of its own name.